Hello everyone, Shirley here. The federal marketplace is huge, $650 billion in discretionary spending, complex, there is no single decision maker, and highly regulated. The FAR consists of 53 parts, 570 subparts, and numerous sections and subsections within each one of those subparts. I mention this because one of the elements of success in government contracting is complying with those regulations. There are other factors that determine success and consequently market value. Those include having profitable contracts that others can perform on, having intellectual property, highly skilled, cleared personnel, and well-run operations. That's what we're talking about today. How do you start years before you want to exit to begin building relationships, winning strategically important contracts, developing talent, and ensuring regulatory compliance so that your company is attractive to multiple buyers and can fetch top dollars? And with the change in administration, there are changing priorities. My special guest today to help us understand not only creating but realizing market value over the next 4 years are Andrew Scherer, founder of Scherer Partners, and Brian Gunther, founder of Exceed Cybersecurity. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you, Shirley. Thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Same here, Shirley. Thank you for having us.
Well, thank you both for joining me today for this important discussion. Please tell our audience a little about yourselves and your companies. Brian, you can go first.
Sure. Again, thanks for having me. So, a little bit about Exceed Cyber. We are a managed security services, or what's also called an MSSP, managed security services provider, and compliance consultancy. So we help organizations who have either legal, regulatory, or contractual compliance requirements that need to be satisfied. We work closely with business owners and IT decision makers to ensure these requirements are met before they run into trouble. That's our job. We also help organizations who want to better secure themselves and reduce the blast radius that could result from a cyber attack by performing risk assessments or providing needed security services that their teams may not be equipped or skilled to handle correctly.
Thank you, Brian. Andrew?
Scherer Partners is an SEC-licensed investment banking firm focused on M&A, or mergers and acquisitions, largely for government contractors. So what does that mean? We represent business owners who want to sell their companies. We represent owners who want to buy. And we also work with business owners who want to prepare for a sale at some point in the near future. We're all senior executives who have decades of experience working with, growing, and exiting government contractors. And our contractors span the range from young firms just starting up all the way through companies that have fully graduated to full and open and serving all branches of the federal government, from the intelligence community to the Department of Defense to any of the civilian agencies.
Excellent. And thank you both. I want to tee up our conversation to help our audience understand the thinking, planning, and decision-making that goes into growing a company that others will find attractive. Brian, I want to start with you because I think many business owners might perceive having a robust security framework in their companies is a pain, it's expensive, and just overhead, an expense that should be minimized if possible. What is your perspective?
Shirley, this is not an unusual stance for business owners to take, let's just be honest. And I can certainly understand the reason why they might think this. In essence, most business owners don't fully understand what their risks are because nobody within their company, particularly small organizations, are responsible for assessing and managing business risk as it relates to information security. Now, that's whether they fall victim to financial fraud, they get hacked, ransomware, or have data stolen, or a myriad of other potential scenarios. Without this knowledge, how is leadership able to decide what's missing and what needs to be done?
Can you elaborate on that, Brian?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. Most business owners tend to believe that their IT guy, in quotes, has their information security or their cyber risk covered. But sadly, that couldn't be further from the truth, as IT management and information security risk management are vastly different skill sets and generally are not services assessed or delivered by the same team. So because of that, my advice is to bring in an outside consultant to perform an independent cybersecurity risk assessment, present the results to leadership and the board, if there is one, who can then action how to manage this previously unknown business risk. And by the way, this is before we even start looking at compliance requirements, whether through the regulatory or contractual requirement perspective.
Andrew, we will get to some of the other factors that create market value in a minute, but what has been your experience regarding cybersecurity when talking to buyers?
Well, it has certainly become more of an issue for buyers than it had been in the past, but it's still largely focused on the due diligence phase of a transaction, which occurs once an offer has been accepted and the buyer is closely examining the target company.
So Andrew, can you give us an idea of what that examination entails?
Sure. One of the major factors is CMMC, and it's good that Brian is here to talk about that. If I remember my acronyms correctly, that stands for Cybersecurity Maturity Model Compliance. That has become a major factor, but it also is an overall review of IT policies and infrastructure and how they include cybersecurity as well as the implications if any breaches have occurred.
Brian, how would you describe the benefits of being prepared?
Yeah, that's a great question. I get that quite a bit, and so a natural follow-up. So in short, the contractors who make the investment in time, treasure, and talent, the 3 T's, to undertake their, let's say, roughly 1 to 2 year CMMC preparation journey, because it takes some time for this thing to start taking off, and eventually become certified by a third-party assessor, an auditor, those organizations will reap the rewards. And here's how. Only those companies who did what they're supposed to do, implemented policies, procedures, systems, and controls to safeguard the government's data and can prove it after passing their certification assessment, only those firms will be awarded contracts in which the CMMC requirements are outlined. This is a tremendous leg up. So in my opinion, this is a major reason to start working on CMMC now.
I agree, Brian. To help our audience plan, what should they budget for an assessment, and how often does that assessment need to be performed?
So you may have a feeling what I'm going to say, but the simple answer is, like an attorney will tell you, well, that depends, right? It depends on the number of assessors available, and there are very few right now. And when the contractor gets, quote, in line for their certification assessment by signing an agreement, and they have to get scheduled for that assessment. However, the numbers I'm hearing from the assessor community, what are called C3PAOs, and that's not R2D2's friend, by the way, certified third-party assessor organizations, can have a very broad range. I've heard as low as $40,000, as high as $60,000 or more just to get the certification assessment done. So it greatly depends on a variety of factors. Further, this doesn't really take into account of all the work and investments to be made to become ready to be assessed. That's what we call the journey. The latter piece is greatly dependent on whether DoD contractors already have all their ducks in a row or not.
Brian, I want to help our audience prepare. How much time and money should small GovCons budget to become ready to be assessed? Do you have any ballpark figures?
What we're seeing is a number between about roughly $100,000 to $150,000 if contractors are starting from zero. Again, these are mostly small contractors. The larger they get, the more complex they become. It becomes more expensive. But that's what we're hearing. But these are not quite fully borne out yet by evidence and feedback from the field. And they're highly dependent on an organization's posture, when they begin the process, and so on.
Thank you, Brian. Andrew, I mentioned earlier a number of factors that make a GovCon company attractive to buyers. Those include having profitable contracts that can be performed by others, strategic relationships that can be leveraged, intellectual property, talented employees, etc. Let's break down your process. When do small GovCons typically come to you, and what are you looking for to advise them properly?
So surely they come to me at all stages of the business life cycle, from startup to ready to sell, because they receive an unsolicited offer. In all those cases, I really want to be able to gather enough information that I can truly understand what the company does, what their contract mix looks like, what their profitability is, and what's the level of sophistication of the management. Generally, government contractors trade on what's called a multiple of EBITDA, EBITDA, which stands for earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. And so just to look at things from strictly a financial perspective, we need to get ideally 3 years of year-end financials, current year financials, and budget if the company prepares one. A contract waterfall, which is a spreadsheet that lays out all of the company's current contracts, where you think of each column as a year and each row as a specific contract, and then you project if all option years are exercised, what would the resulting revenue and gross margin be? A bid pipeline, and then as we use those to calculate both trailing EBITDA and do some projections, if there are any significant personal or one-time expenses that an owner has run through the business, we need to understand those so we can then construct what's called adjusted EBITDA. Now, that's the financial side. From the strategic and business side, what we generally try to do is advise them to do the following. Some of this may seem obvious, but when we have these conversations with owners, sometimes I think this is the first time they've thought about this. For instance, find a way to move from the most restrictive types of set-aside contracts, 8A and SDV OSB, to small business or full and open. Try to win prime contracts, again, ideally as a small business or full and open. You really need to upgrade the quality of your accounting 12 to 18 months before you intend to go to market. If you win a multi-year contract as a prime, that's usually a great time to go to market, because then the buyer will have the maximum amount of runway left on those contracts. And make the owner less important to the day-to-day running of the business.
So, Andrew, you packed a lot into that response. I understand that companies need to move toward full and open contracts that they intend to sell. That's one of the things that I help companies with. But elaborate, if you will, on the importance of timing and making the owners less relevant.
In many cases, the way government contractors have started their business is you have an owner. Maybe he's worked for a larger prime, or maybe he's coming out of the government and he's a subject matter expert. And so he goes back to the prime he left, or he goes back to the customers that he has, and they want to take advantage of that expertise that he's developed. And so they find him a contract or find him a place as a subcontractor and make him take advantage of that subject matter expertise. The problem is, when an owner is billable and is an SME, you need to find a way to move them away from that role, to bring in other people that can fill it so they can then focus on running their business, as opposed to having the dual role of being both the subject matter expert and being billable and working 30, 40 hours a week, and then taking on the full-time job of trying to run a business. Now, the expertise that some of these people have often makes it harder to find someone equally qualified that the customer will feel comfortable with. But you need to start that process as soon as possible. If the owner isn't billable, but it's critical for the business development or proposals, they also need to develop that next level of management and have them in place performing these functions that will in turn make it easier for the owner to exit.
I agree, and I see that all the time. We need to take a break. I'm talking to Andrew Scherer, founder of Scherer Partners, and Brian Gunther, founder of Exceed Cybersecurity. When we come back, we'll talk about what CEOs most often misunderstand about cybersecurity, winning government contracts, and creating market value. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Shirley Collier, President and founder of Scale to Market, is your host for this Growth Masters Federal presentation. Scale to Market helps businesses think, plan, collaborate, and build market value by developing and executing customized, data-driven business development playbooks, building efficient information systems, and creating high-performing BD teams. Utilizing the proprietary Davy Business Development Growth Framework, Scale to Market partners with business owners and executives to increase their company's value by achieving profitable and sustainable growth in the federal marketplace. Email Shirley at scollier@scaletomarket.com to learn more about the Davy Growth Framework and how it can be instrumental in helping grow your federal contracting business. Back now to Shirley's conversation with Andrew Scherer and Brian Gunther as they discuss how GovCons create, realize, and optimize the market value of their company.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about making your company attractive to potential buyers. Brian, coming back to you and the importance of cybersecurity, what do most small GovCon CEOs most often misunderstand about cybersecurity compliance?
I tend to think that the single biggest misunderstanding, Shirley, is that business leaders tend to have around cybersecurity compliance, for example, CMMC, is that following a compliance framework tied to cybersecurity makes them, by association, 100% secure. And that is simply never true. I just want to go on record and say that. Frankly, it's not even really true if you have a very strong security posture separate from compliance requirements. Now, while following a mandated cybersecurity framework will certainly improve your security posture to some degree, I think most would agree with that, it should not be confused with having a fully secure organization where information security is central to your operation, what we call a culture of cybersecurity. There are always risks, and nobody is immune from having a security incident. For example, like I said earlier, a hack or a data theft, ransomware, and even wire fraud where, people try to steal money from you. Now, as an example, CMMC maturity level, or what's called ML2, which mandates that DoD contractors safeguard controlled unclassified information, CUI, is only concerned with the confidentiality of the data. And that's focusing on who can access this sensitive data. What's not a real focal point around CMMC is the integrity or the availability of that data. Integrity means, in information security parlance, it's verified, it's valid, and it's trusted, whereas availability means, will the information be available and accessible when the authorized user needs that information? So think of your data being held for ransom, which just means it's encrypted and you can't access it because it's locked up with a certain type of key that you don't have access to, and then makes it inaccessible to you and your team. If you don't have ironclad backups that are what we call immutable, then the availability of that data just simply can't be guaranteed.
Thank you, Brian. I would be remiss if we didn't address the potential impact of the change in administration. None of us have crystal balls, of course, but do either of you expect there will be an impact on the GovCon world? Andrew, what do you think?
Surely, there's definitely going to be an impact, but I think it's just unrealistic to think that we know what that impact is going to be. What I think a lot of people don't realize is that the budget for 2025 is largely set. And while there may be the ability of the incoming administration to do some changes around the edges, I don't think we're going to see any major changes. So really what you're thinking about is 2026 and beyond, and how will changes in spending priorities come to pass. From my perspective, I think the agencies least likely to be affected are the Department of Defense, the intelligence community, and the Department of Homeland Security.
What about Health and Human Services? Do you think those agencies are vulnerable to cuts?
I think we're going to see some significant changes in the way HHS and the other agencies under that organization, what they're spending and task priorities are. But it also depends on who ends up getting confirmed, which is something we're not going to know for a little bit of time. I was speaking to the owner of a government contractor just the other day who has done a lot of work, and what they told me was, as it turns out, because of the type of areas where they're focused, their success during the first Trump administration was higher than they might have expected. So I think certainly the trend will be we're going to see some major changes, but how it's going to play out in spending cuts are still to be determined.
Brian, what's your opinion?
So I've had several conversations with folks in this ecosystem that are security compliance practitioners in this CMMC world, and the response is generally the same. Requiring security for a defense contractor to safeguard FCI or CUI, which is a big part of national security, is a very bipartisan effort and is fully expected to continue going forward. Now, gone are the days when advanced persistent threats, what we call APTs, can just walk through the digital door of our nation's defense contractors and steal our plans and our ideas, designs, and possibly even intellectual property, right? So the IP. The DoD has let the defense industrial base be, frankly, just too lax for too long. And this, just by the way, is why CMMC was created, as I alluded to in the first place. It was started under the first Trump administration around 2019 and continued throughout the current administration and going into the next Trump administration because everyone involved realizes that our national security interests truly rise above politicking.
I agree. Do you see these requirements being extended to the federal civilian agencies soon?
Depends on whether other agencies get on board with the CMMC, let's call them constructs, if you will. And those related foundational elements, by the way, which go under the National Institute of Standards and Technology, called NIST, under Special Publication 800-171, and its control family that actually safeguard and outline how to safeguard this mission-critical data, right? That's really what's behind the scenes here, is making sure you did what you're supposed to do. And then CMMC is making sure you did what you're supposed to do. And the fact that the DoD has now successfully blazed that trail may give other agencies an opening or maybe cover to require their supply chain contractors to implement the same, whether it's CMMC or some similar type of security framework for their agency.
So many contractors have been concentrating on the negative impacts from the new administration. And although there are many unknowns, I think that some of the campaign rhetoric, if implemented properly, could actually benefit federal contractors. If the federal civilian workforce shrinks, either through attrition or layoffs, that could mean additional opportunities for contractors to fill critical positions. The work of most agencies still needs to be performed. But in addition, most of us who have been doing business with the federal government for years see the inefficiencies in the acquisition and contracting processes and in the agency's operations. I think this represents an opportunity for innovative, highly efficient small businesses to have a big impact. What do you think, Andrew?
I totally agree. Let's just look at DoD, which represents a significant amount of federal spending. I don't think anybody, whether it's a contractor or a politician or somebody who works within the agency, wouldn't agree that the acquisition process is just broken. I mean, things take too long, requirement changes significantly increase the cost of programs, and at the end of the day, we end up with far too many inefficient weapon systems or procurements that don't even come close to fulfilling what the original promise was. So I think there's definitely room to improve the acquisition process for DoD and for the rest of the federal government.
Brian, what do you think?
I can tell you that those firms who do get on top of CMMC, they really will be strongly positioned to win contracts when their competitors, again, remember those who sat on their hands and did little to nothing and kind of stuck their head in the sand, they just cannot qualify for the bid nor be awarded, as the DoD contracting officers will have a whole new slate of DFARS requirements that simply just disqualify the lackadaisical firms from this process altogether.
Thank you, Brian. The world is a scary place, and we have many enemies. Spending on defense and cybersecurity is not likely to decrease. After many fits and starts, CMMC certification requirements for DoD contractors are here, and we speculate will soon be required by federal civilian agencies. The GovCon acquisition market is hot right now, but buyers are increasingly reviewing and requiring strong cybersecurity practices and CMMC certifications from sellers because, frankly, they can't win government contracts otherwise. And regarding the priorities of the new administration, I hope there will be a renewed emphasis on innovation and agency operational efficiencies, which small government contractors have traditionally been very good at. I see an opportunity for small businesses, especially those that are leveraging AI and other emerging technologies, to have an even greater role to play going forward in serving the American people. Before we close, Andrew and Brian, any final words of advice or wisdom? Brian, you want to go first?
Oh, sure. The way I see this is part of your goal is to build value in your company. Don't be foolish and refuse to conform to your contractual requirements. You'll only shoot yourself in the foot or at worst create legal problems for yourself. Those who start getting a move on now and take CMMC compliance seriously will win more contracts. And by simple inertia, they'll grow their companies to become more attractive acquisition targets. I believe Andrew would probably agree with that. So it's just another smart business move to start working on your exit. So security and business growth in the DoD supply chain are now mutually inclusive and inextricably linked to their shared future success, in my opinion.
I agree. Andrew?
I'm a strong believer that as a business owner, you need to prepare for an exit as early as possible. The choices you make as a business owner when you set up your company, what the corporate form is, how you deal with other owners of your company, the contracts you pursue, the agencies you pursue, the infrastructure that you build will ultimately help you build a more successful company, whether you end up selling or not. But when that day comes, when you get that unsolicited offer, if you have made those choices and been diligent in thinking about an exit, you'll end up with a better process.
Andrew and Brian, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with our audience today.
Shirley, thanks so much. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. And Brian, thank you so much for sharing your insights.
Absolutely. Same to you, Andrew. Shirley, thanks for having us. The pleasure really is all mine. And I appreciate you having me as your guest to share with the audience today. And I feel really strongly that what we discuss is critical to your viewership and your audience, and that hopefully it'll increase that contractor's value in the marketplace. That's what we all want.
Absolutely. Folks, if you would like to get in touch with Andrew, he can be reached at asherer@shererpartners.com, and that's SCHERER, or he can be reached at 443-414-8341. And Brian with Exceed Cybersecurity can be reached at brian@exceedcyber.io, and that's EXCEED cyber.io, or by calling 240-377-0504. Or you can reach out to us here at Skelton Market, and we'll make sure you're connected. This is Shirley Collier, President of Skelton Market and host of the Growth Masters Federal Podcast, signing off for now. As we close, I want to thank you for joining us today and encourage you to connect with me on LinkedIn and visit our website, that's scale2market.com with the number 2 in the middle, where you will find a link to our webcast, which now include open captioning for those seeking more clarity in the narrative, along with our podcast, white papers, my blog, and other links and resources. While there, please leave us a comment or suggestion so we can stay focused on what's important to you. We'll see you next time.